Okay, so the book of Esther then, everyone. Let's do what we usually do then. We'll take an overview of the book and then we'll focus on different aspects of the story. So the book of Esther, and if you look at the first chapter, you see that the events of the book of Esther primarily take place in the capital city of Susa. We saw this yesterday with Nehemiah. And we're in the third year of the reign of Ahasuerus. Now, there's some debate over which king this is, but the majority of people seem to settle on the idea that we have here King Xerxes. So we're looking at about 483 BC to 473 BC for the kind of historical context. So it's during the captivity, the 70 years. We've seen a lot of things about those 70 years. We've looked at Ezra and Nehemiah. So we're aware now of the years of captivity, and that's where this story of Esther is set. So as for the structure of the book, we have three sections, and chapters 1 and 2 form the introduction. And it's a very well-known introduction. We meet the king. We meet his queen Vashti. You remember the very famous occasion when the king has been feasting. He then is drunk, and he sends for his wife, Queen Vashti, to come to visit him, and she refuses. And therefore the king asks his counselors what he ought to do. And they advise him to deal harshly with Vashti because she has set an example for all the other wives. If she's let unpunished, then other wives will follow her lead and learn disobedience to their husband. And so the king deals harshly with Vashti, and then he has what's effectively a beauty contest to find his next queen. Chapter 2, you have the details of this beauty contest with Esther. As one of the candidates, she catches the king's eye, and Esther becomes queen. So that's the first two chapters, very quickly, very roughly discussed. Those two are the introductory chapters. And then you get the main action of the book of Esther from chapter 3 through to chapter 9 and verse 19. And there are two ideas in this main section. And the two ideas are the conspiracy, the challenge, if you like, to the Jewish people, and resolution. Now, I'm sure most of us know the story, but we'll think a little bit about that main story in a moment or two. That's the central section of the book of Esther. And then you get the conclusion. So as you turn through the chapters, you come to chapter 9 and verse 20. And from chapter 9, verse 20 through to the end, you've got the conclusion to the story. So it's a very simple structure. Lots of the books are very simple in structure. And the idea is the action is set around a whole series of feasts or banquets. And of course, ultimately, the book of Esther gives rise to a Jewish feast, the Feast of Purim. That's not mentioned here in the account, of course, but nonetheless, it's a whole series of banquets that provide the backdrop for the event. So just as an example, if you look at chapter 1, verses 3, verses 5, verses 9, you get reference to feasts. Chapter 2, you get reference to feasts. And then, of course, famously, Esther herself puts on a series of feasts where she is going to present her husband, the king, with the problem that she has faced. So a whole series of banquets then become very important in the book of Esther. And if you want a theme, then the theme is a reversal of destiny, the reversal of events in sudden and unexpected ways. So the whole narrative of the story of Esther is going in one direction, the persecution of the Jews, and then suddenly there is a turn, there is a change, and the whole situation is resolved. And that's the idea of the book of Esther. That phrase of a sudden transformation of events has a particular term, and we look at that term later on. So the story itself then, well, I'm sure you remember the story. We've got Esther as queen, her uncle Mordecai is one of the king's advisors, and the story unfolds when Mordecai discovers a plot. There's a plot against the life of the king by two chaps, Bigthan and Teresh, and Mordecai is kind of recognized as the person who's made the king aware of this plot, but he's not initially rewarded. Instead, we're introduced to the bad guy, and the bad guy is Haman. And Haman is appointed the king's viceroy. And in chapter 3, we see Haman in all his glory, and I think he's going on some sort of parade or some triumphal march or something, and Mordecai refuses to bow to him. And that's where all the trouble begins. Because Mordecai is Jewish, and the culture is that you only honor God and you don't honor men, he refuses to bow. So in chapter 3, verses 2 to 5, we meet this man Mordecai. He's refusing to acknowledge Haman in all his pomp and all his glory. And so what many think is a very extreme reaction, Haman then makes a decision in his anger and fury that not only does he have to destroy Mordecai, he has to destroy all the Jewish people. And he puts this to the king, and the king inadvertently, perhaps, or later on comes to see it as a mistake, agrees to Haman's plot. And lots are cast to settle on a date. Now, the Hebrew word, or I guess the Aramaic word, I'm not sure, for lots is Purim. And that's where we get the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated amongst Jewish people today. So lots are cast and a date is settled on which many Jews are going to be murdered. So we have ethnic cleansing, if you like. There's this strange word which I've never understood, pogrom. This pogrom is planned against the Jewish people. And Mordecai takes things to heart, as you'd expect. He applies himself to God. And then he puts to Esther the need for Esther to intervene and to plead with the king. So if you look at chapter 4, you have Esther agreeing to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people, her own people, of course, because she's Jewish, to plead with the king. And you get those very famous verses in chapter 4. So just take a look at chapter 4. We'll read some of the verses. Verse 13 of chapter 4. Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Now, Esther's the queen. She's locked in the harem. Mordecai is outside. They have to have go-betweens to have a conversation. So Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. That's from this massacre. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows, and here's the great line, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And most commentaries on the book of Esther take that line as the title to their book, for such a time as this. So that's Mordecai's challenge to Esther. Esther then replies, verses 15 and 16, and her reply is equally famous. Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Susa and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will then go to the king. And here's her famous line, which is against the law. If I perish, I perish. Now that's an equally powerful line in which Esther is recognizing that she can't just go into the king's presence when she wishes. She needs to be invited, like Vashti was summoned. But she's going to take the initiative, go into the king's presence, and she's resigned, if you like, to the purposes of God. If the king welcomes her, then he does. If the king decides that she's behaved wrongly and punishes you, then so be it. She has that kind of sense of balance. If I perish, then I perish. Well, of course, famously in chapter 5, she puts on a feast. Here's the theme of feasts again. She goes before the king. The king summons her. He extends his orb towards her. She can then approach the king. And so we have the plot unfolding, in which she then is able to put to the king the problem that the Jewish people are facing. So there's 2 feasts in chapter 5. And then we get this moment of reversal in chapter 6. Remember, the theme of Esther is that the whole direction is going one way, the whole story is going in a certain direction, and things change dramatically. Haman has built a gallows, hasn't he, so that he can hang Mordecai. And in chapter 6, there's this unfolding of the drama where the king can't sleep. He remembers the service Mordecai has done for him. He realizes he hasn't honored or rewarded Mordecai. So he starts to talk out loud to Haman, his viceroy. And he says very famously, chapter 6, verses 4-9, Haman, what shall I do to a man who has rendered me great service? How can I honor such a man? And of course, Haman then thinks that the king is referring to him. So Haman's hopes are up and he's beginning to expect some great reward. And of course, it turns out that it is Mordecai that the king is thinking of, and it is Mordecai that the king wishes to honor. That's a very ironic passage in which you are seeing the enemy of the Jewish people made to look foolish by his own vanity and his own conceit. So Haman has said to the king, give him robes, let him ride on a horse, give him a place of great honor, and so on. And of course, it's all to do with Mordecai. Chapter 7 then, through to chapter 8, you've got the great resolution to the great crisis that the Jewish people are facing, this massacre that has been put into law. And of course, the law cannot be reversed. It's the law of the Medes and the Persians, so you don't repeal any of the laws. So as you go through chapter 7, and Esther is putting the dilemma to the king, they come up with a plan. And the plan is that immediately before the day on which the Jews were meant to be massacred, the Jews themselves will be armed, and they will be allowed to have a preemptive strike. They can strike first against those who intended to harm them. So the original law stands, but there's this new law enabling the Jews to strike out against their enemies. And we have, if you like, a series of occasions where the Jews fight by taking the initiative, with Esther the queen in charge. And of course, the ultimate irony in all of this is the gallows that Haman has decided to hang Mordecai on become the gallows where Haman himself is executed. And you can see in chapter 8 how that then happens into chapter 9. And you've got a great reversal. It's the whole idea of this change that has occurred in the fortunes of the Jews. And as the book of Esther ends, we've got Esther as queen, and Mordecai then is going to advance to the king's viceroy. So we've got a very famous story, very well-known story. And the reason why many people think this story is included in our Bibles is it emphasizes something that we've already discussed. If you think of Moses bringing out the people from Egypt, you have the whole account of the miraculous, the extraordinary, the direct intervention of God. You've got dramatic events and divine interventions. And often throughout Scripture, you see God working in these miraculous and dramatic and exciting ways. What happens, of course, in the book of Esther is the exact opposite. We are taught by this book that God works his purposes through the ordinary events of human life, through ordinary human interactions, through jealousies, through rivalries, through courage, if you like, the non-miraculous. This is what the whole book is emphasizing. God works out his purposes. God works through his people when they are involved in the ordinary stuff of life. Now, yes, we've got kings and we've got queens and we've got feasts and we've got plots, but nonetheless, the idea is that these are the stuff of life. In a royal court, this kind of behavior would happen all the time. We've seen it with Vashti. She refused to go to the king. So if you take the context of royal life, you've got very ordinary events. You've got laws being passed. You've got rivalry. People want promotion. People want recognition. People want honor. That's the ordinary stuff of royal court. But it's through that God works his purposes out. So if you like, the book of Esther is an antidote to the idea that God only ever works miraculously or dramatically or extraordinarily. This book is a counterbalance to the whole notion that we need God to do the dramatic stuff if God is actually to be seen to be at work. It's the ordinary events. Now we know, don't we, that like the book of the Song of Solomon, there is no direct reference to the name of God here. But the key idea we've noted in verse 4, such a time as this, that God arranges the pieces. If you like, the queen and Mordecai, the fact that her parents had died, God organizes all the pieces of human activity. He puts the right person in the right place for the right time so that he can then work out his purposes and he can preserve his people. That's the idea. And I think it's an antidote we all need, that God works out through ordinary means, the average human interaction. That's the main idea then of the book of Esther. But I want to, if I can, just say a little thing about this idea of reversal. So I want you to imagine the letter U. So if you think of the letter U, the story of Esther begins with this downward movement in which Haman has organized a persecution of the Jews. The date is set, it's unalterable, the law is passed, you cannot repeal the law. So the direction of the narrative is downwards. And then what you have suddenly is this change. And the change occurs through Esther's intervention and through the king's sleeplessness and the king talking to Haman. There's a sudden reversal, and then you have a change of direction. You have an upward turn. And in that upward turn, you then have a whole reversal of circumstance. Now think of that letter U. And that letter U is a feature of many of our biblical narratives. And bear with me now, okay? We don't mind the odd technical term, do we? I want to give you a technical term that helps us understand this idea of the letter U and of how things change, how circumstances reverse. And the technical term is a Greek word, and it's not just applies to our Bibles. It's a term that you'll find in lots of literary forms, and the technical term is peripety. The word peri, we get the English peripatetic. It means to move around, and it's the idea of how a story suddenly changes direction. You didn't expect it. Everything looks set. We seem to be very much prepared to face an inevitable outcome, and then you get a sudden change and the whole situation is reversed. Now that's what is happening in the book of Esther, and God brings about that sudden and dramatic reversal in the story of Esther through very ordinary means. Now what I want you to do is think about other occasions in our Bibles where you have a peripety, where you have a sudden and dramatic reversal of a situation. And at least three come to mind to me. The third of them is not very kind of obvious, but two of them are very obvious indeed. So let's think of a certain person, and this certain individual, shall I say his his life is set on a very obvious trajectory, and you're expecting his life to work out in a certain way, and it just seems inevitable, and that's all we're going to expect, and then you get a sudden reversal in this person's experience. Now, this person is slightly different to the book of Esther, in as much as it's an extraordinary event that turns this person's life around. But nonetheless, that letter U is seen in this person's experience. Now, can you identify who it is? Who is going off in a certain direction, very much in a sense like, I guess, Haman in a sense, perhaps. And then you get the sudden dramatic turning. So see if you can identify who that is. And then it seems as if Jesus makes use of this technique when he teaches his parables. And there's a very famous parable where you have this U-shaped narrative. Someone goes off in a certain direction, and then the narrative turns and this person comes back. And again, if you think of this parable and you can identify this parable, it's very ordinary means that brings about this change of direction in the subject of this parable. This is a very famous parable. We've already looked at it when we were looking at the gospel in which this parable occurs. And there's another element to this parable that's not found in the book of Esther. And that's the moment when a person comes to their senses. That's another biblical idea. It's got another fancy name that I won't go into with you. It's when a person sits, reflects, and suddenly understands, suddenly comes to their senses and realizes what they've done. And then the whole of life is turned and you get that upward curve. Anyone might be able to identify the parable there? Okay, so think of the book of Esther then as this great U-turn. Everything's set in one direction, then you've got an unexpected and very ordinary method of bringing that change, and then up we go in an entirely new and unexpected direction. So that's the book of Esther, set during the 70 years. You do wonder whether if she was based at Susa, she would have known Nehemiah, or did Nehemiah serve a different king? As I say, there's a lot of debate as to how to correctly identify the king here, Ahasuerus. The Jewish people continue then to acknowledge the Feast of Purim, and it's seen as a great deliverance. And of course, it places Esther as one of those 7 women in the Old Testament who are given high honor and great recognition. So that is the book of Esther.